"Are you sure you know how to handle that thing, old-timer?" The words sliced through the desert air like a blade, dripping with arrogance and contempt. Major Caldwell stood there in his crisp digital camouflage, every crease razor-sharp, every ribbon gleaming under the blazing California sun. He was everything the modern Marine Corps represented: polished, confident, and absolutely certain of his authority. At his feet sat an old man, 83 years weathered by decades of silence, his hands moving with surgical precision over the disassembled parts of an M40 sniper rifle. The weapon was scarred, worn, a relic from another era, just like its owner, some might say. But here is what Major Caldwell did not know, what none of them standing at that shooting range could possibly imagine. That quiet old man cleaning his rifle had a story that would shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about respect, honor, and what it truly means to serve. What happened next would destroy one man's career and remind an entire military base why you should never, ever judge a warrior by his age. Major Thomas Caldwell was a man carved from ambition and granite. Fresh from a successful tour at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, he wore his rank-like armor, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a fast-track career. Behind his tactical sunglasses, his eyes held the cold confidence of someone who had never truly been tested by fire. He was the poster child for the new Marine Corps, educated at the Naval Academy, fluent in PowerPoint presentations, and absolutely convinced that respect was something that came automatically with the gold oak leaves on his collar. The public shooting range off Highway 78 was his weekend domain, a place where he could display his marksmanship skills and bask in the admiration of younger Marines who looked up to him. Today he had brought two fresh-faced corporals, barely 20 years old, eager to impress their commanding officer. They stood behind him like shadows, mimicking his posture, feeding off his confidence. Norman George sat on a simple wooden stool, his back ramrod straight despite his advanced age. The morning sun caught the silver in his sparse hair, and his weathered hands moved with the kind of precision that only comes from performing the same ritual thousands of times. Before him, spread on a worn canvas cloth, lay the components of his M40 rifle. The wooden stock was dark with age and oil, marked with nicks and scratches that spoke of a long and storied history. Each movement was deliberate, economical, practiced. He slid a cleaning patch through the barrel with the same reverence a priest might handle a sacred relic. His jacket was an old M65 field coat, the kind you might find gathering dust in a military surplus store. It was clean but frayed at the cuffs, the fabric softened by countless washings. To Caldwell, it represented everything he despised about wannabe veterans, civilians who bought military gear and pretended to be something they were not. The phenomenon had a name in military circles: stolen valor, and Caldwell had made it his personal mission to root out these pretenders wherever he found them. "I asked you a question, Pops," Caldwell pressed, taking a step closer. The gravel crunched under his immaculate combat boots, the sound sharp in the morning air. "This is a live fire range. We have regulations. That relic looks like it belongs in a museum, not out here with real shooters. I need to see your range permit and your identification. Now." Norman finished threading the cleaning rod through the barrel, carefully placing it down beside the other components. Only then did he slowly lift his head. His eyes were pale blue, clear as mountain water, and utterly unfazed by the confrontation. They held a depth that seemed to defy his age, a stillness that spoke of experiences far beyond anything these young Marines could imagine. He looked at the major, then at the two corporals flanking him, and offered no immediate reply. This quiet defiance stoked Caldwell's irritation into something hotter. He saw obstinacy, perhaps even senility. He could not see the deep, quiet waters of experience that lay behind those ancient eyes. Staff Sergeant Dave Evans had been watching the confrontation unfold from 2 lanes over, his jaw tightening with each passing moment. An off-duty Army Ranger with 3 deployments to Afghanistan under his belt, he recognized the look in the old man's eyes. It was the same expression he had seen in his platoon sergeants back in Kandahar, a weary patience that came from enduring things that men like Caldwell only read about in after-action reports. More importantly, he recognized the arrogant posturing of an officer whose ego far outstripped his actual combat experience. Evans had grown up in a military family in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where respect for veterans was not just expected, but demanded. His grandfather had served in Korea, his father in Desert Storm. He knew the unwritten rules of military culture, and watching a Marine major publicly humiliate what appeared to be an elderly veteran violated every principle he held sacred. When Caldwell reached for the old man's rifle, threatening confiscation and mental evaluation, Evans knew he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He turned away from the scene, pulling his phone from his pocket with deliberate casualness. His fingers found the contact for Chief Warrant Officer Miller at the Provost Marshal's office on the nearby Marine base, a crusty, knowledgeable man who served as the unofficial fixer for any and all problems that arose in the local military community. "Chief Miller, it's Sergeant Evans," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but we have got a situation down at the public range off Highway 78. A Marine major named Caldwell is harassing an old man, accusing him of stolen valor, threatening to have him arrested. The major is way out of line, Chief. The old guy is just trying to mind his own business. What's the old-timer's name?" Miller's voice carried the gravelly boredom of a man who had dealt with countless weekend incidents involving overzealous officers and civilian complaints. "George," Evans said, glancing at the driver's license still lying on the bench. "Norman George." He paused, then added the detail that felt most important. "Chief, the patch on his jacket. It's faded, but I think it might be an early force recon patch. Something's not right here. Caldwell is about to physically remove him." There was a moment of absolute silence on the other end of the line. When Chief Miller spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp electric urgency that made Evans's blood run cold. "Say that name again, Sergeant." "Norman George," Evans repeated, his heart suddenly pounding as he sensed the seismic shift in the conversation. "Stay exactly where you are, Evans. Do not engage. Do not let that major leave with him. I am handling this personally." The line went dead, leaving Evans staring at his phone with the unsettling realization that he had just set something massive in motion. Inside the air-conditioned confines of the Provost Marshal's office at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, Chief Warrant Officer Miller stood bolt upright, the phone still trembling in his hand. He turned to his superior, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who was reviewing weekend duty rosters with the resigned patience of a career officer stuck with administrative duties. "Sir, you need to hear this immediately," Miller said, his voice tight with an emotion Hayes had never heard from the normally unflappable chief. "Sergeant Evans is reporting a Major Caldwell publicly harassing a civilian at the range off 78. An elderly man." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked up with mild annoyance. "Well, tell Caldwell to knock it off and file a report Monday morning." "Sir," Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "The civilian's name is Norman George." The name hit Lieutenant Colonel Hayes like a physical blow. The pen in his hand clattered onto the desk, and his face went ashen. For a moment, he was completely speechless, his mind racing to connect a name he had only heard spoken in hushed, reverent tones with the image of an old man being harassed at a public shooting range. "Get me his file," the colonel finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Right now." Miller was already typing frantically at his computer. Seconds later, a file appeared on the screen, almost entirely redacted with thick black bars, but the visible words were enough to tell the story. Classified. Top secret. Eyes only. And under a list of commendations that read like a roll call of American heroism: Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device for valor, Purple Heart with 4 oak leaf clusters, indicating 5 separate wounds in combat, unit affiliation, 1st Force Reconnaissance Company, Special Projects Group, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The official records were largely classified ghosts, but the legend was known to every senior Marine who had studied the history of their craft. Norman George was not just a veteran, he was a founding father of modern Marine Corps Special Operations, a man whose innovations in long-range reconnaissance and sniper tactics were still being taught at the Scout Sniper School in Quantico. Hayes grabbed his secure phone, his hands shaking slightly. "Get me the base commander immediately. I do not care if he is on the golf course or in the middle of Sunday dinner with his family. Get him on this line right now." He looked at Miller with wild urgency. "And you get a security detail. 2 vehicles. Military police, lights, and sirens. I want you at that range 5 minutes ago. You treat this like a Medal of Honor recipient is under threat. Go, go, go." Back at the range, Major Caldwell was savoring what he perceived as his complete victory. He had cornered the old fraud, exposed him for what he really was, and was now demonstrating his leadership to the small crowd that had gathered. The silent stares of the onlookers were not disapproval in his mind, but confirmation of his authority and decisive action. "All right, Grandpa," he said with a final arrogant flourish, placing a firm hand on Norman's shoulder. "Show's over. You are coming with me. We are going to have a little conversation down at the station, and then maybe we can find you a nice, quiet room where you cannot hurt anyone." It was the ultimate insult, not just questioning Norman's honor, but threatening his freedom and dignity. Norman did not flinch or resist. He simply looked up at Caldwell, and for the first time, a flicker of profound disappointment clouded his calm blue eyes. It was the expression of a man who had seen both the very best and the very worst that humanity could offer, and was deeply saddened to find the latter standing before him, wearing a uniform he held sacred. That was when the first Diran became audible in the distance, growing rapidly closer. The convoy of military vehicles arrived like a scene from an action movie. Black SUVs and marked military police cruisers screeched into the parking lot, emergency lights painting the dusty range in strobing red and blue. Doors flew open before the vehicles had completely stopped, and uniformed MPs fanned out with the precision of a tactical operation. From the lead vehicle emerged Colonel James Morrison, his uniform immaculate, a constellation of combat ribbons spanning 3 decades of service. He moved with unmistakable command presence, his eyes scanning the scene until they locked onto the elderly man seated calmly at lane 4. Recognition dawned across his face like sunrise, followed immediately by a wave of pure reverence. Colonel Morrison strode directly to Norman, completely ignoring the bewildered Major Caldwell who was attempting to salute. He stopped 3 feet away, drew himself to full attention, and delivered the sharpest, most respectful salute of his distinguished career. "Mr. George," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It is an honor, sir." The fallout was swift and decisive. Major Caldwell found his fast-track career derailed, reassigned to a logistics depot in the Mojave Desert where promising careers went to die. The base commander, shaken by the incident, instituted mandatory quarterly training called Legacy and Humility, focusing on veteran recognition and the difference between authority and leadership. Weeks later, in a small roadside diner, Norman sat across from a humbled man in civilian clothes. Caldwell had sought him out to apologize properly, without audience or uniform. As they shared coffee and conversation, the old warrior offered a lesson in grace to a young officer who desperately needed to learn it. The story of Norman George became a quiet legend, a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most unassuming forms. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one whose voice carries the most weight, whose silence speaks volumes about strength, and whose simple presence reminds us what true honor really means. If this story of dignity, respect, and hidden heroism moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to BR Veteran Stories for more tales of courage and character that remind us why we should never judge a book by its cover, and always remember that the greatest warriors often walk among us in the quietest forms.